Sometimes the moment you think your life is perfect is the moment it has already been sold without your knowing. The notification came at exactly 9:17 p.m., soft and almost polite against the quiet glow of Naomi Carter's phone screen. A simple bank alert that should have meant nothing but instead rewrote everything. $10,000 deposited. No name. No message. Just a number that didn't belong to her world. Not really. Not yet. Naomi stood barefoot on the marble floor of the Manhattan penthouse she had once called home. The city stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a skyline dipped in gold and shadow, beautiful in a way that almost felt rehearsed, like a life designed for someone else. She didn't move at first, didn't breathe. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass. Elegant, composed, invisible. The wife of Ethan Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines. A man who built empires with the same precision he used to control every room he entered. A man who had once looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. That look had faded slowly. So slowly she almost convinced herself it was still there, hidden beneath late meetings, missed calls, and the quiet shift of his voice from warm to measured, from present to distant. Naomi lowered her phone, her fingers steady in a way that surprised even her, as if her body understood something her mind had not yet caught up to. $10,000. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't kindness. It was a decision. Somewhere in the apartment, a soft laugh echoed, familiar, bright, misplaced. Lily Monroe. Best friend. Sister in everything but blood. The kind of person who knew your secrets before you spoke them, who held your hand through the moments no one else saw, who had been standing closer to Naomi's life than anyone realized. Naomi turned her head slightly, not enough to be seen, just enough to listen, and in that small, suspended second, everything aligned with a clarity so sharp it felt almost peaceful. She didn't need to see them to understand. She didn't need proof to confirm what her silence had already begun to accept. The money came first. The truth followed. Or maybe the truth had been there all along, waiting for her to finally look at it without love softening the edges. She walked slowly toward the glass, the city lights flickering beneath her like 1,000 distant signals, her reflection sharpening as she stepped closer, no longer blurred by distance. There was no trembling, no tears, just a quiet recalibration. Behind her, the laughter continued, unaware, careless, already moving forward without her. Naomi placed her phone down on the marble counter with deliberate care, the screen still glowing faintly with that number, that message without words, that exit already planned. She tilted her head slightly, studying the woman in the reflection as if meeting her for the first time, and for the first time in a long time, she saw something that hadn't been there before. Not love, not hope, not even pain. Clarity. The kind that doesn't ask questions. The kind that doesn't beg for explanations. The kind that simply decides. Naomi Carter did not turn around. She did not call out their names. She did not break the illusion that had already broken itself. Instead, she reached for her coat, her movements calm, precise, almost gentle, as if she were leaving a place that no longer required her presence. Because the truth was simple, and simplicity had its own kind of power. Someone had already decided she would leave. They had just forgotten to ask her how. And that was their first mistake. The elevator doors closed without a sound, sealing Naomi Carter inside a mirrored silence that reflected her from every angle. A woman standing perfectly still while her entire life shifted beneath her feet, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not as pain but as recognition, as if something long dormant had finally been called by its real name. Betrayal was not loud, it was precise. It arrived in quiet rooms and left without apology, and as the elevator descended from the penthouse toward the ground floor, she did not press any buttons again, did not hesitate, because hesitation belonged to the version of her that had still believed love was enough to hold something together, and that version no longer existed. Outside, the Manhattan night wrapped around her like a different kind of truth, colder, sharper, more honest. The city moving without pause as if reminding her that nothing waited for anyone to catch up, and Naomi stepped onto the sidewalk with nothing but her coat, her phone, and $10,000 that did not belong to her, but had somehow found her anyway. She walked without direction at first, heels steady against the pavement, each step deliberate, not rushed, not lost, just forward, until the lights of a small 24-hour cafe cut through the darkness, and she pushed the door open, the soft bell above it marking her arrival in a place that did not know her name, did not care about her past, and did not expect anything from her except to sit, to breathe, to exist. She chose a seat by the window, ordered black coffee she did not intend to drink, and placed her phone on the table again. The number still there, unchanged, waiting, as if it had been sent not just to be seen, but to be understood. Naomi stared at it longer this time, her mind no longer searching for who sent it, but why it had been sent now. Why tonight? Why before she had even walked into that silence upstairs? And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the answer began to form with a clarity that made her lips press into a thin line of something that was not anger, but something far more controlled. This was not random. This was not kindness. This was preparation. Someone had anticipated her exit before she had even considered leaving. Someone had calculated her value down to a number and decided that was enough to erase her from a life she had helped build. She leaned back slightly, the leather seat creaking beneath her, her reflection faintly visible in the cafe window layered over the moving lights of the street. And for the first time since the notification appeared, something inside her shifted from observation to decision. Naomi Carter had been given $10,000 to disappear, but what they had not accounted for was that she did not need permission to redefine what leaving meant. She picked up her phone again and opened the transaction details, tracing every line, every digit, every coded reference until she found the smallest thread, a routing number that connected to a private account, and beneath that, a name hidden behind a corporate shell she recognized not from personal life, but from documents she had once seen on Ethan's desk, files she had never been meant to study, but had memorized anyway, because she had always paid attention to the things people assumed she would overlook. Her fingers stilled, her eyes sharpening as the realization settled fully into place, not explosive, not dramatic, just certain. The money had not been sent to save her. It had been set aside for someone else, planned for a different ending, redirected by timing, by fate, or perhaps by the simple fact that she had been standing exactly where she was not supposed to be. Naomi exhaled slowly, a breath that carried no tremor, no hesitation, and she closed the screen with a quiet finality before reaching into her coat pocket, pulling out nothing but her bare hand and placing it flat against the table as if grounding herself in the present moment. She did not need to know everything yet. She did not need to confront anyone tonight. She did not need answers from people who had already shown her what they were willing to become. What she needed was distance, clarity, and time, not to heal, but to rebuild. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across her face, illuminating her eyes in a way that revealed something new, something that had not been there even an hour ago. Not softness, not sorrow, but intention. Naomi Carter was no longer reacting to what had been done to her. She was beginning to decide what would happen next, and somewhere between the quiet hum of the cafe and the distant rhythm of the city, the woman they thought they had dismissed for $10,000 started to understand exactly how much she was worth, and exactly how little they understood about what she was capable of becoming. By the time the first light of morning slipped between the buildings, Naomi Carter had already made her decision, not in a dramatic moment, not with a declaration, but in the quiet certainty that settled into her bones like something that had always belonged there. The coffee in front of her had gone cold, untouched, a detail she registered without caring. Because what mattered was not what she had lost overnight, but what she had finally seen clearly, and clarity had a way of stripping everything down to its simplest truth. She stood from the small table without hesitation, placing a few bills beneath the cup out of habit rather than necessity, and stepped back into the city as it shifted from night to day, the streets filling with movement, ambition, purpose, none of it waiting for her, none of it needing her. And yet for the first time in a long time she felt aligned with that rhythm instead of out of place within it. She did not return to the penthouse, not for clothes, not for closure, not for anything that required explanation, because explanation was a privilege given to people who still held emotional authority. And Ethan Whitmore no longer had that. Instead, she checked into a boutique hotel 3 blocks away, a space small enough to be temporary but quiet enough to think. where the staff did not recognize her name and the walls did not carry echoes of a life that had already ended. The room was modest compared to what she had known. A single large window, neutral tones, a bed that did not try to impress. And Naomi placed her coat neatly over the chair before sitting at the desk, her phone in front of her once again. The number still there, unchanged, waiting for her to decide what it meant. She opened the transaction details again, slower this time, tracing each line not as a victim searching for answers, but as someone studying a system, mapping its structure, identifying its flaws. Because if there was one thing Naomi had learned from years of standing beside power, it was that nothing powerful was ever careless, and nothing valuable was ever left unprotected unless someone believed it would never be questioned. Her eyes settled again on the corporate routing path, the layered ownership, the quiet trail that led back to something buried inside Ethan's world, not directly his name, not openly his account, but close enough to confirm what she had already begun to suspect, that this money had been positioned with intent, calculated for a moment that was supposed to unfold differently, for a woman who was not her, for an ending that had not gone according to plan. Naomi leaned back in the chair, her fingers steepled lightly beneath her chin, and allowed herself a single, measured exhale, not relief, not anger, just acknowledgement. They had prepared for a transition, just not hers. Her gaze shifted to the window, the city now fully awake, sunlight reflecting off glass towers in a way that felt almost ironic, because everything looked the same from a distance, polished, successful, untouched, and yet she knew how quickly that illusion could fracture once you understood where to apply pressure. She reached for her phone again, not to call, not to confront, but to begin something far more deliberate, opening a blank note and typing a single line. What they planned, what they missed, what I build next. She paused after the last word, reading it once, then again, letting the simplicity of it settle into something solid, something real. Naomi Carter was not rebuilding her life from nothing. She was rebuilding it from knowledge, from access, from understanding the architecture of a world she had been quietly observing for years, and that difference would matter. She stood and walked toward the mirror mounted beside the closet, stopping just close enough to see herself clearly, no longer softened by reflection, no longer framed by someone else's space. Just her, steady, composed, unshaken in a way that did not need to be proven. She studied her face for a moment, not searching for signs of what had been lost but recognizing what had been revealed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her posture shifted, shoulders aligning, chin lifting just enough to signal something internal had recalibrated. They had underestimated her because she had allowed them to, because invisibility had once felt like safety, because silence had once been mistaken for weakness, but silence, when chosen, was not absence. It was preparation. Naomi reached for her bag, placing her phone inside with deliberate care, and turned toward the door without looking back at the room. Because even this was temporary. Even this was just a step in something much larger that had already begun. As she stepped into the hallway, the soft click of the door closing behind her marked the end of something that did not need to be revisited, and the beginning of something that did not need permission. Somewhere across the city, decisions were still being made without her, plans still unfolding as if she had already been removed from the equation, and Naomi allowed herself the faintest trace of something that almost resembled a smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of certainty. They believed she had been given $10,000 to leave, but what they had actually done was give her the first piece of something far more valuable, and this time, she would decide exactly how the story continued. The first call came at exactly 8:42 a.m., sharp and efficient, just like everything Ethan Whitmore allowed into his life, and Naomi Carter watched her phone vibrate against the glass table without reaching for it, her eyes steady, her breathing even, because timing was no longer something she reacted to, it was something she studied. The name on the screen confirmed what she already expected, and when the vibration stopped, it did not feel like silence. It felt like space, the kind of space that reveals who holds power and who is simply used to having it. Across the city, in a corner office wrapped in steel and glass, Ethan stood with his phone still in his hand, jaw tight, expression controlled in the way that had built his reputation. But control, he was beginning to understand, was not the same as certainty. and Naomi's absence had introduced something into his world that he had not accounted for. Not chaos, not loss, but a gap. Precise and deliberate, like a missing piece in a system that had always functioned perfectly. He called again, this time holding the phone to his ear longer, as if patience could force an answer, but there was none, only the faint echo of his own expectation returning to him unanswered. Back in the quiet hotel room, Naomi finally picked up the phone, not to respond, not to acknowledge, but to turn it over in her hand as if measuring its weight against what it represented. And then she placed it face down, ending the moment without a word, because silence, when chosen, carried more authority than any explanation. She moved toward the desk again, opening her laptop this time, the screen lighting her face in a cool, focused glow, and with a series of deliberate keystrokes she began to map what she had only outlined before, not emotions, not memories, but structure, access points, connections. The architecture of a system she had lived inside long enough to understand without ever being seen as part of it. Ethan's world was not just money, it was networks, layered ownership, silent partnerships, and Naomi had spent years observing it from the edges, absorbing patterns, noticing the details no one thought to hide from someone they assumed did not belong in the conversation. She opened financial registries, traced shell corporations, followed the path of the account that had sent the $10,000, and each step revealed not a mistake, but a strategy, one that had been designed with precision and confidence, one that had assumed compliance, disappearance, closure. Naomi leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing not in frustration but in recognition, because the more she saw, the clearer it became that this had never been about ending something cleanly. It had been about controlling the narrative of how it ended. And that was where they had miscalculated. Her fingers moved again, faster now. Opening a new document, building a framework not of defense but of creation, because she was not interested in stepping back into a life that had already dismissed her. She was interested in building something that made dismissal irrelevant. Outside, the city carried on, taxis moving, people crossing streets, conversations beginning and ending without her. But inside that room, something far more significant was taking shape, not visible, not announced, but real in a way that did not require validation. Hours passed without interruption, the sunlight shifting across the room, marking time in quiet increments, and Naomi did not rush, did not look at the clock, because urgency belonged to people reacting to loss, and she was no longer reacting. Sometime in the early afternoon, her phone lit up again, a message this time. Not from Ethan, but from Lily Monroe, short, almost casual, as if nothing had truly changed, as if familiarity could still reach her where explanation had not. And Naomi glanced at the screen for less than a second before turning back to her work, not deleting it, not responding, simply allowing it to exist without impact, because relevance was something she now chose, not something she inherited. By the time she finally closed her laptop, the outline in front of her was no longer an idea. It was direction, clear, structured, intentional. And Naomi rested her hands lightly on the desk, her gaze lifting toward the window where the city reflected back at her in layers of glass and light. They believed she had stepped out of their world, that she had been reduced to a number, a transaction, an ending already decided. But what they had not understood was that Naomi Carter had never needed their world to define her position. She had only needed to understand it well enough to step beyond it. She stood slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, and as she reached for her coat once more, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a quiet, undeniable shift in presence, the kind that did not ask to be seen but inevitably would be. Somewhere, decisions were still being made without her, calls being placed, assumptions being reinforced, but for the first time, Naomi was no longer inside that system, she was outside it, and from there, the rules were no longer fixed. They were hers to rewrite. By late afternoon, the city had shifted into that quiet, electric anticipation that lived between business hours and evening indulgence, and Naomi Carter stepped out of the hotel, not as someone escaping her past, but as someone moving with intention towards something that had already begun to take shape beneath the surface. Her coat rested perfectly against her shoulders, her stride measured, her presence no longer blending into the background, but subtly commanding space without demanding attention, the kind of presence that came not from status but from certainty, and certainty, she had learned, could not be borrowed. It had to be built. She walked 3 blocks south, then turned east, her route deliberate, not random, until she reached a discreet office building tucked between glass towers that reflected far more attention than they deserved, a place most people passed without noticing. And Naomi paused for only a fraction of a second before entering, because hesitation belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. Inside, the lobby was quiet, efficient, polished in a way that did not try to impress, and she approached the front desk with calm precision, her voice steady as she gave a name she had not used in years, one that did not belong to the wife of a billionaire, but to the woman she had been before she ever stepped into that world. And within seconds, access was granted without question, because systems rarely challenged confidence when it arrived. In the right tone, the elevator carried her upward, each floor passing in silence, and Naomi used the reflection in the brushed steel walls not to adjust her appearance, but to confirm her alignment, shoulders back, gaze steady, no trace of doubt, because doubt had no place in what she was about to do. When the doors opened, she stepped into a corridor lined with glass offices and muted conversations, the kind of environment where decisions were made quietly, but carried weight far beyond the room. And at the end of that corridor stood a door marked with a name she recognized not from personal connection, but from documents, contracts, and filings she had studied over the past 12 hours with surgical precision. She knocked once, not waiting long before the door opened to reveal a man in his early 50s, composed, observant, the kind of person who measured others before speaking, and for a brief moment his expression held curiosity, then recognition, and finally something closer to understanding. Naomi did not smile, did not offer pleasantries. She simply stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the sound soft but definitive, as if sealing the beginning of something that could not be undone. She placed her phone on his desk, the screen already open to the transaction, the $10,000 displayed without explanation, and she met his gaze with a calm that did not invite negotiation. "This was not meant for me," she said, her voice even, precise, each word carrying more weight than volume ever could, and the man did not immediately respond, his eyes shifting briefly to the screen before returning to her, assessing, recalculating, because in that moment he understood what few people ever did, that Naomi Carter was not here to ask questions. She was here because she already had answers. "No," he said finally, his tone careful, controlled. "It was not." And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was strategic, the kind that allowed truth to settle without being forced. Naomi nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, then moved to the chair across from him and sat without invitation, her posture composed, her presence undeniable. "Then you know why I am here," she continued, not as a question but as a statement, and again, he did not rush to respond. Because people who operated at his level understood that timing was as important as content, but Naomi had already stepped into that rhythm, already aligned herself with the pace of power rather than reacting to it. "I know what this account was structured for," she said, her eyes steady, her tone unshaken, "and I know where it connects." And this time, something shifted in his expression, subtle but undeniable, because knowledge, when presented without arrogance, was far more dangerous than accusation. Naomi leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance between them without invading it, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, grounded, controlled. "I am not here to return it," she added, the words simple, direct, final, and for the first time, the man allowed himself a small exhale, not relief, not tension, but recognition of a shift he had not anticipated. Naomi Carter had not come to fix a mistake, she had come to redefine it. And in that quiet office, far from the penthouse that had once defined her place in the world, something far more significant began to take form, not as revenge, not as reaction, but as strategy, and strategy, when built on clarity, did not need permission to succeed. The man behind the desk did not interrupt her, did not challenge her, and that alone told Naomi Carter everything she needed to know. because men like him only stayed quiet when they understood the stakes had already shifted beyond negotiation, and as the silence settled between them, it no longer felt like a pause. It felt like alignment. He leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled in a mirror of her earlier posture, his gaze steady, no longer measuring her as an outsider but recognizing her as someone who had stepped into the conversation with full awareness of its weight. "You should not know this much," he said finally, his tone calm, but edged with something sharper, not threat, not warning, but acknowledgement of a boundary that had been crossed without permission. Naomi did not react to the statement, because it was not new information, it was confirmation. And confirmation did not require response, it required action. "I know enough," she replied, her voice even, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation, and she allowed the words to sit in the air without elaboration, because power did not come from saying more. It came from knowing when to stop. Outside the glass walls of the office, movement continued, assistants walking past, conversations unfolding, unaware that inside this room, the balance of something far larger had quietly shifted, and Naomi remained still, grounded. Her presence no longer defined by where she came from, but by where she had chosen to stand. The man reached for a folder on his desk, opening it with deliberate care, as if the physical motion itself required acknowledgement, and he turned it slightly toward her, not offering it fully, but not hiding it either, a gesture that existed somewhere between caution and concession. Inside were documents Naomi had already anticipated, structures of ownership, outlines of funds, connections that tied the transaction to a network designed to move quietly and remain unseen, and she did not lean forward, did not rush to examine them, because urgency would have suggested doubt, and she carried none. "This was arranged weeks ago," he said, his voice steady, "for a transition that was supposed to be controlled." And Naomi allowed the faintest shift in her gaze, not surprise, not shock, just recognition, because control, she had learned, was always an illusion maintained until someone chose not to follow it. "For Lily Monroe," she said, not asking, not accusing, simply placing the truth in the room with the same calm precision she had carried since the moment she left the penthouse. And this time, the man did not respond immediately, his silence deeper. Now, more deliberate, because naming something removed its protection. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed but intentional, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to study the room, the clean lines, the muted colors, the quiet efficiency that defined spaces where decisions were made without spectacle, and she understood something then, something that settled into her with the same clarity as the number on her phone the night before, that this was not about replacing one position with another. This was about stepping into a level where positions were created, not assigned. "You assumed she would leave with it," Naomi continued, her tone unchanged, her words measured, "and you assumed I would not see it." And there was no accusation in her voice, only fact, because facts did not need emotion to carry weight. The man closed the folder slowly, his fingers resting on its edge as if grounding himself in something tangible, and when he spoke again, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. "What do you want, Miss Carter?" he asked, and for the first time, the question was not dismissive, not procedural, it was real. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because timing mattered, and she had learned to let silence do its work before filling it. She stood then, smooth, unhurried, and walked toward the window behind his desk, the city stretching out beneath them in layers of glass and steel, a reflection of power that looked permanent from a distance, but was always dependent on who controlled the foundation. She placed her hand lightly against the cool surface of the glass, her reflection merging with the skyline, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had guided her since the moment everything changed. "I want access," she said, not louder, not softer, just clear. "Not to this account, not to this mistake, but to the structure that made it possible." And the words did not echo, did not need to, because their meaning landed exactly where it was intended. Behind her, the man remained still, his silence no longer defensive but contemplative, because he understood what she was asking, and more importantly, he understood what it meant to give it. Naomi turned back to face him, her expression composed, her gaze steady. And in that moment, there was no trace of the woman who had been left out, of a life the night before, only the presence of someone who had stepped beyond it entirely. You built a system that moves quietly, she continued. I intend to learn how it moves. And with that, the room shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not reverse, because once knowledge was claimed with intention, it could not be returned to ignorance. And Naomi Carter had no intention of going back. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt measured, as if the room itself was recalibrating around a new center of gravity. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she stood, her hand resting lightly against the glass, her reflection aligned with a skyline that no longer intimidated her because she had begun to understand what it was built on. Behind her, the man did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the question she had posed did not exist within the boundaries of routine negotiation. It existed beyond it, in the space where decisions carried consequences that could not be reversed once set in motion. He stood slowly, moving from behind the desk with deliberate control, each step quiet, intentional, until he stopped a few feet away from her, not close enough to intrude, not distant enough to disengage. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, less guarded, more direct. Access is not something we give lightly, he said, not as refusal, but as definition. And Naomi turned to face him fully, her expression unchanged, her posture unwavering, because she had not come here expecting ease, she had come prepared for resistance. I am not asking lightly, she replied, her tone even, the words settling between them without urgency, without pressure, simply existing as fact. And for a moment, they stood in a quiet understanding that had nothing to do with agreement and everything to do with recognition. Outside, the city moved in patterns she now saw differently, no longer as a backdrop, but as a system of intersecting decisions, each one shaped by people who understood how to position themselves at the right moment. And Naomi had just stepped into that understanding with clarity that could not be undone. The man studied her for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, not in defeat, not in concession, but in acceptance of a shift he could no longer ignore. You realize, he said carefully, that once you see how it works, you cannot unsee it. And Naomi allowed the faintest tilt of her head, not in uncertainty, but in acknowledgement of a truth she had already embraced, because there was no version of her that intended to return to what she had been. That is the point, she said, and this time, there was something beneath the calm. Not anger, not bitterness, but resolve, quiet and absolute. The man nodded once, a small movement that carried far more meaning than its size suggested, and he turned back toward the desk, opening a different drawer, one that had remained untouched until now, retrieving a slim folder and placing it on the surface with deliberate care, the gesture controlled, final, as if crossing a line that could not be redrawn. Naomi stepped forward, closing the distance with the same steady rhythm that had guided her since she walked out of the penthouse, and she placed her hand on the folder without opening it immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented, because this was no longer about a single transaction. It was about entry into a structure that had been designed to remain unseen. This is not everything, he said, his voice measured, but it is enough to begin. And Naomi nodded once, her fingers resting lightly against the cover, her gaze steady, because beginnings, she had learned, did not need to be complete. They needed to be intentional. She opened the folder then, her eyes scanning the contents with quiet precision, absorbing not just the information but the patterns beneath it, the way entities connected, the way decisions flowed, the way influence moved without being named. And with each page, her understanding deepened, not overwhelming, not chaotic, but structured, logical, something she could work with, something she could build from. Minutes passed without words, the room holding a silence that no longer felt uncertain but purposeful. And when Naomi finally closed the folder, she did so with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, her hand resting briefly on its surface as if sealing what had just been set in motion. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly, and for the first time, there was no trace of the woman who had been underestimated, No shadow of the role she had once played, only presence, defined, deliberate, undeniable. "Then we begin here," she said, her voice steady, and it was not a question, not a request, but a statement of direction. And in that moment, the shift became complete, not because permission had been granted, but because she had stepped fully into the space where permission was no longer required. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Whitmore was still searching for answers he believed he was entitled to. Lily Monroe was still operating within a plan she believed was secure, but neither of them understood what had already changed, that the woman they thought had quietly disappeared had instead moved into a position they could not see, and from that position, the next move would not belong to them. Naomi Carter picked up the folder, her grip steady, her expression composed, and as she turned toward the door, there was no pause, no second glance, only forward motion. Because what she had just claimed was not a reaction to betrayal. It was the foundation of something far greater, and this time, she would not be standing beside power, she would be building it. The hallway outside the office felt quieter than before, not because the building had emptied, but because Naomi Carter had changed the way she moved through it, no longer as someone passing unnoticed, but as someone who understood exactly where she was and why it mattered. And as she stepped into the elevator with the folder held securely in her hand, she did not look down at it again, because what she carried was no longer just information, it was direction. The doors closed with a soft precision, sealing her into a mirrored space that reflected her from every angle. And this time, she did not study her reflection to confirm who she was. She already knew the uncertainty that once lingered in her. Posture replaced by something steadier, something quieter, something far more dangerous than confidence, certainty built on knowledge. The elevator descended floor by floor, each number lighting briefly before disappearing, and Naomi allowed herself a single, controlled breath, not to steady herself, but to acknowledge the shift that had already taken place, because what she had just stepped into was not temporary. It was foundational. When the doors opened, the lobby greeted her with the same neutral elegance it had offered earlier, but it no longer felt like a place she entered cautiously. It felt like a place she moved through with intention, and as she crossed the polished floor toward the exit, no one stopped her, no one questioned her, because authority, when carried correctly, rarely needed to be announced. Outside, the city had deepened into evening, lights reflecting off glass towers in a way that blurred edges and softened distances, and Naomi paused just long enough to take in the skyline, not with admiration, not with longing, but with assessment, because now she saw it for what it was, not just beauty, but structure, layered, controlled, interconnected. Her phone vibrated again in her coat pocket, persistent, insistent, but she did not reach for it immediately, because urgency no longer dictated her response, and when she finally did pull it out, the screen confirmed what she already expected: multiple missed calls, messages stacked one after another, Ethan Whitmore's name repeating with a frequency that would have once unsettled her, but now registered only as information. She opened one message, not to engage, but to understand, his words concise, controlled, attempting to re-establish order through language, asking where she was, asking why she had left, asking for a conversation, as if conversation could restore what had already been broken, and Naomi read it once, then again, before closing the screen without reply. Because explanation was not owed to someone who had already made his decisions without her. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and began walking, her steps steady, unhurried, moving through the city not as someone searching for direction, but as someone following one already set in motion. And as she moved, her mind did not return to the penthouse, did not replay the moment she had left, because the past had already served its purpose. It had revealed what needed to be seen, and she had taken from it what she needed to move forward. Instead, her focus remained on what she now held, the structure she had begun to understand, the connections she could trace, the opportunities that existed not in what had been taken from her, but in what had been exposed. She turned onto a quieter street, the noise of traffic fading slightly, replaced by the softer rhythm of footsteps and distant conversations, and she allowed herself a moment to slow, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Because pace, she had learned, was as important as direction. She stopped beneath the reflection of a glass storefront, her image merging briefly with the city behind her, and for a second, she studied it, not searching for validation, but acknowledging transformation, because the woman who had stood in that penthouse the night before would not have recognized the one standing here now. And that difference was not visible in clothing or posture alone. It was in the absence of doubt, the absence of waiting, the absence of needing to be chosen. Naomi Carter was no longer standing inside someone else's narrative. She was stepping fully into her own. She adjusted her coat slightly, the motion small but deliberate, and resumed walking, her path clear, her purpose steady, because what came next would not be announced. It would be built, piece by piece, decision by decision, in spaces that did not require permission or recognition to exist. Somewhere behind her, in offices and penthouses and conversations she no longer belonged to, assumptions were still being made, conclusions still being drawn, but they were based on a version of her that no longer applied, and Naomi allowed herself the faintest trace of something that was not satisfaction but certainty, because for the first time, she was not reacting to a world that had overlooked her. She was moving ahead of it, and ahead, she understood, was exactly where she intended to stay. The next morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with clarity, and Naomi Carter welcomed it without hesitation as she sat at a small corner table in a quiet midtown workspace, her laptop open, the folder from the night before resting beside it like a silent contract between who she had been and who she was becoming. And for the first time since everything shifted, she allowed herself to fully step into the work, not as distraction, not as escape, but as construction. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with controlled precision, not rushing, not pausing unnecessarily. Each action aligned with a plan that was no longer abstract but defined, because what she had gained was not just access to information, it was insight into movement, into how influence traveled through structures designed to appear invisible. And Naomi understood that visibility was never the goal, control was. She cross-referenced entities from the folder with public registries, mapping connections that revealed patterns beneath the surface, identifying where capital moved quietly, where decisions were made before they ever became announcements. And with each discovery, her posture remained steady, her expression unchanged, because this was not surprising to her. It was confirming what she had always sensed but never been invited to explore. Hours passed without interruption, the ambient noise of the workspace fading into something distant and irrelevant, and Naomi did not check her phone, did not revisit the messages waiting there, because attention, she had learned, was a resource, and she no longer gave it away without purpose. Instead, she opened a new file and began outlining her own structure, not mirroring what she had seen but adapting it, refining it, building something that did not depend on the same assumptions that had allowed others to underestimate her. And as she worked, the outline expanded, evolving from a concept into something operational, something that could exist independently of the world she had just stepped out of. She paused briefly, not out of doubt, but to review what she had created, her eyes scanning each line with quiet scrutiny, adjusting where necessary, reinforcing where it mattered. And when she leaned back in her chair, there was no question about what came next, only a recognition that the next step required execution, not contemplation. She reached for her phone then, not to respond to the past, but to initiate the future, scrolling through contacts she had not used in years, names from a different chapter of her life, people who had known her before she became someone else's reflection, and she selected one without hesitation, her thumb hovering for only a second before pressing call. The line rang once, then twice, and when it connected, the voice on the other end carried a familiar mix of surprise and curiosity, but Naomi did not fill the space with explanation. She did not offer context or history. She simply spoke with the same calm precision that had guided her since the moment everything changed, outlining what she needed, what she was building, and what role they could play in it. And as she spoke, her tone remained steady, not persuasive, not demanding, but certain, because certainty did not require negotiation, it invited alignment. When the call ended, she did not wait for reassurance, did not question the outcome. She placed the phone back on the table and returned to her laptop, continuing where she had left off, because momentum, once established, did not need to be forced. It needed to be maintained. Outside the window, the city moved through its routine, unaware that within this quiet space, something had begun that would not announce itself until it was already impossible to ignore. And Naomi allowed herself a brief glance at her reflection in the glass, not to measure progress, but to acknowledge presence, because presence, she had learned, was the foundation of everything that followed. She closed the folder slowly, not discarding it, but placing it aside, because it had served its purpose. It had opened a door, and now she was walking through it on her own terms. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Whitmore was still searching for control, still attempting to restore a narrative that no longer belonged to him. And Lily Monroe was still operating within assumptions that had yet to be challenged. But Naomi no longer existed within their timeline. She had moved ahead of it, and ahead, she understood, was not defined by what had been taken, but by what she chose to build. She lifted her coffee, now warm instead of forgotten, and took a slow, deliberate sip, not out of habit, but out of presence, because for the first time, she was not preparing for what might happen next. She was creating it, and creation, she realized, was the one thing no one could take from her once she decided it belonged to her alone. By the time the week began to close, Naomi Carter was no longer working from borrowed spaces. She had established her own, a quiet office tucked into a discreet building that did not advertise ambition but quietly housed it. A place where decisions could be made without interruption, without observation, and as she stepped inside that morning, the air carried a sense of alignment that had not existed just days before. Because what she was building was no longer theoretical, it was operational. The desk was minimal, the screens clean, the structure she had outlined now layered across multiple systems, each connection deliberate, each movement tracked, not to control everything, but to understand enough to move precisely when it mattered. And Naomi moved through the space with calm efficiency, her coat placed neatly, her bag set aside, her focus already engaged before she even sat down. Her phone rested on the desk, silent now, the messages from Ethan Whitmore and Lily Monroe no longer increasing, not because they had stopped reaching out, but because she had stopped existing within their expectations, and absence, she understood, created its own kind of pressure, the kind that forced others to reveal more than they intended. She opened her laptop and reviewed the latest updates, the contacts she had initiated beginning to respond, not with questions, but with cautious interest. Because people recognized opportunity when it was presented with clarity, and Naomi did not. Present possibilities, she presented direction. One message stood out, not because of urgency, but because of its tone, measured, respectful, aligned, confirming that the first piece of her structure was no longer just an idea, it was agreed upon, and Naomi allowed herself a brief pause, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge progress, because progress, she had learned, was built quietly before it was ever seen publicly. She leaned back slightly, her eyes moving to the window where the city reflected in layers of glass and movement, and for a moment, she considered how quickly perspective had shifted, how what once felt distant and controlled by others now felt accessible, not because the system had changed, but because she had stepped into a position where she could see it clearly. Her phone vibrated once, a single notification, and this time she reached for it without delay, not out of urgency, but out of intention, because she had already decided that this moment would come, and when she opened the message, the name confirmed it, Ethan Whitmore, but the tone was different now, less controlled, less certain, the words shorter, more direct, asking not for explanation but for a meeting. And Naomi read it once, then again, her expression unchanged, because what he was asking for was not a conversation. It was access to her time, her presence, her response, and she had already redefined the terms under which any of those would be given. She placed the phone back down without replying immediately, her gaze returning to the screen in front of her, where numbers and structures continued to align, because what mattered was not his request, it was her timing, and timing, she now understood, was where real power existed. Minutes passed. Deliberate, controlled. And when she finally picked up the phone again, she did not type quickly, did not rush to respond. She entered a single line, precise, measured, and sent it without hesitation. Tomorrow. Noon. Whitmore Tower. And when the message left her screen, she did not wait for a response. because confirmation was not necessary. The meeting had already been set by the act of sending it. She stood then, moving toward the window once more, the city stretching out beneath her in a way that no longer felt overwhelming but structured. Each building, each street, each reflection part of a system she was no longer outside of. And as she looked out, there was no anticipation, no anxiety, only clarity. Because the meeting that would take place the next day was not about revisiting what had been lost. It was about establishing what had changed, somewhere across the skyline. Ethan was preparing for a conversation he believed he understood. Lily was still moving within a narrative she assumed was secure, but Naomi Carter had already stepped beyond both of them. And tomorrow would not be a return, it would be a revelation, not for her, but for them, because for the first time, they would see her. Not as someone they had dismissed, but as someone they had failed to understand, and understanding, she knew, always came a moment too. Late for those who underestimated what they could not control. At exactly 12 o'clock the next day, the glass doors of Whitmore Tower opened with the same quiet authority they always had. But for Naomi Carter, nothing about this moment resembled what it once would have been, because she was not arriving as a wife returning to familiarity. She was arriving as someone who had chosen to stand on entirely different terms, and as she stepped inside, the polished marble floors reflected not just her silhouette, but the shift in presence that had taken place. Within her, steady, composed, untouchable in a way that did not need to be declared. The lobby carried its usual rhythm, assistants moving with purpose, executives passing through with controlled urgency, but Naomi did not adjust her pace to match them. She moved at her own, measured, deliberate, each step aligned with intention rather than reaction, and as she approached the reception desk, the recognition in the attendant's eyes was immediate, followed quickly by something else, uncertainty. Because the context in which Naomi had once been known no longer applied. She did not offer explanation, did not acknowledge familiarity. She simply stated, "I am here to see Ethan Whitmore," her voice calm, precise, leaving no room for interpretation, and within seconds, access was granted, not because of who she had been, but because of how she carried herself now. The elevator ride to the top floor felt shorter than it ever had before, not because time had changed, but because anticipation had been replaced by clarity. And when the doors opened to reveal the executive level, Naomi stepped out without hesitation, her gaze steady, her posture aligned, as if she had always belonged here, just not in the way anyone had previously understood. The conference room doors were already open, a subtle signal that she was expected, and inside, Ethan Whitmore stood near the window, his back partially turned, his posture rigid in a way that suggested control rather than ease, and when he turned to face her, the expression he carried was not the one she remembered, not the composed confidence that had once defined him, but something quieter, something unsettled beneath the surface, as if he had spent the last 24 hours searching for an answer that had not come. Naomi entered the room without pause, the sound of her heels against the floor measured and steady, and she did not stop until she reached the chair opposite him, placing her folder on the table with calm precision before sitting, her movements unhurried, her presence unmistakable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy but exact, as if both understood that whatever was said next would define everything that followed. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that had once held familiarity, but now carried something closer to disbelief. "You left," he said, the words simple, but lacking the control they once would have had, and Naomi met his gaze without flinching, without softening, because she no longer needed to adjust herself to fit within his expectations. "I did," she replied, her tone even, her voice steady, and she allowed the words to exist without elaboration, because explanation was not the purpose of this meeting. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. In a gesture that revealed more than he likely intended, the polished composure beginning to fracture in subtle ways. Without saying anything, he added, and this time, there was a question beneath the statement, one he did not fully articulate, but Naomi understood it clearly, not as concern, but as confusion, because he had never imagined a version of events where she chose silence over confrontation. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed but deliberate, and for the first time, she allowed a shift in expression, not warmth, not anger, but clarity sharpened into something unmistakable. There was nothing left to say. She answered, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any accusation ever could. The room held that truth for a moment, letting it settle, and Ethan's gaze did not leave her, searching, recalculating, trying to understand something that no longer followed the patterns he was used to controlling. "You could have talked to me," he said. Quieter now, less certain, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady, not dismissing him, but no longer engaging on his terms. "You already made your decision," she replied, her voice calm, her words precise. "I simply responded to it." And there it was, the shift made visible, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Because this was no longer a conversation between two people navigating the same reality, it was a moment where one of them had stepped beyond it entirely. Ethan stood still for a second longer, the silence stretching just enough to reveal what he could not yet accept. That control had moved, not to someone louder, not to someone more aggressive, but to someone who no longer needed to be included in his version of events to define her own. And Naomi Carter sat across from him, composed, unwavering, not as the woman he had underestimated, but as someone he was only just beginning to understand, far too late to change what had already been set in motion. The air in the room shifted after her last words, not dramatically, not with tension that could be named, but with a quiet recalibration that neither of them could ignore, and Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture composed, her presence grounded in a certainty that did not need reinforcement, while across from her, Ethan Whitmore stood caught between recognition and resistance, his silence no longer controlled but searching, as if he were trying to reconstruct a version of reality that no longer aligned with what he was seeing. He moved toward the table slowly, his steps measured, but there was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable, the absence of the effortless authority that had once defined him, replaced instead by something more deliberate, more cautious, as if each movement required consideration. "This is not how things end," he said finally, his voice steady but lacking the finality it once carried, and Naomi allowed a brief pause before responding, not to challenge him, but to let the statement exist on its own, because some truths revealed themselves more clearly when left uncorrected. She placed her hand lightly on the folder in front of her, her fingers resting against its surface with quiet intention, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision that had guided her from the moment she walked away. "It already ended," she said, and the simplicity of it landed with a weight that no argument could shift. Ethan's gaze flickered briefly to the folder, then back to her, his expression tightening in a way that suggested understanding just beyond reach. "What is that?" he asked, not sharply, but with a controlled curiosity that betrayed the first signs of uncertainty, and Naomi did not rush to answer, because timing, she had learned, shaped perception as much as content. She opened the folder slowly, turning it toward him with deliberate care, not presenting it as evidence, not as accusation, but as clarity, and as his eyes moved across the documents, the connections, the structures, the account that had been prepared for a transition he believed he controlled, something in his posture shifted again, this time more visibly, the recognition no longer distant but immediate. "You knew," he said quietly, the words not fully formed as a question. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "I understood," she replied, the distinction precise, intentional, because knowing implied reaction, and understanding implied choice. The room held that difference for a moment, allowing it to settle into something neither of them could dismiss, and Ethan straightened slightly, his composure attempting to reassemble around him. But the effort was visible now, no longer seamless, no longer unquestioned. "You think this changes anything," he said, and there was an edge to it, not anger, but something closer to disbelief, as if he were testing the limits of a reality that refused to return to its previous form. And Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed, her presence unshaken, because she no longer needed to prove anything within this space. "It does not change what you did," she answered, her tone even, her words steady. It changes what I do next. And the distinction landed with quiet precision. Because this was never about rewriting the past. It was about redefining the future. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, searching for something familiar, something he could anchor himself to, but what he found instead was distance, not physical, but structural, a shift in position that he could not close simply by standing in the same room. And what exactly is that? He asked. And this time, the question carried weight, not because of authority, but because it acknowledged something he had not expected to need to ask. Naomi allowed a brief pause, her eyes steady, her expression composed, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained exactly as it had been, calm, controlled, undeniable. I build, she said, and the words did not require elaboration, because everything about her presence already explained what they meant. She closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, not reclaiming it, but concluding it, and she stood, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if the outcome of this meeting had never been in question, because for her, it had not. Ethan remained where he was, watching her, the silence between them no longer something to fill, but something that marked the distance he could not cross. And as Naomi turned toward the door, there was no hesitation, no second glance, only forward motion, because what she had come to do had been done, not in confrontation, not in conflict, but in clarity. The door opened quietly, the hallway beyond unchanged, the world outside continuing without pause, and Naomi stepped through it with the same steady rhythm she had carried from the beginning, leaving behind not just a room, not just a conversation, but a version of herself that no longer existed. And as the door closed behind her, the shift became complete, not because he accepted it, but because she no longer needed him to.